The first thing I noticed was how quiet the street had become. No humming from the power lines, no sound of lawnmowers or dogs barking, or even the occasional car rumbling down our cul-de-sac. Just the thick, uneasy stillness that settles after a storm's done what it came to do. My socks were soaked through, the left one more than the right, and I could feel tiny bits of insulation clinging to my ankle where it had torn through the attic floorboards. The boards weren't built for weight, especially not after 3 days of rain, but we'd had no choice. The house was half submerged, and the attic was the only dry place left. The front door was open now, tilted slightly off its hinges from the wind that had battered it all night, and the porch creaked as I stepped down. My son followed just behind me, bare feet crunching against the debris-covered floor, the only blanket we had shared still wrapped around his shoulders. I could feel the wet fabric of my shirt clinging to my back. My hair pulled into a loose knot that hadn't seen a brush in 2 days, and my legs ached from the cold night spent pressed against hardwood and damp insulation. I didn't hear the click of a camera. I didn't notice anyone standing across the street either. It wasn't until hours later, when the phone started lighting up again, when neighbors finally got signal, when people started posting photos of fallen trees and collapsed carports, that I realized someone had been watching. Not just watching, documenting. A blurry photo from across the street, framed by the neighbor's window, had already made its way onto the local community page. The caption read, "Mother and son or something else?" And the comments below were already piling up. What unsettled me wasn't just the implication. It was the way we looked in that image. The way my arm was hooked around his waist like we were clinging to each other for something more than survival. The way his head leaned against my shoulder, not from exhaustion, but as if he'd chosen to rest there. I tried to laugh it off at first. Told myself people post stupid things online all the time. But I knew better. This town may act polite, but it thrives on whispers, and people love a scandal more than they love being right. When the flood warnings came 2 nights ago, we'd barely had time to throw things in the attic. I remembered hauling up boxes of old Christmas decorations and bags of hand-me-down blankets, not really thinking we'd need them. We weren't even supposed to be home together. He'd flown in from New York for the funeral, the man I married after his father, and we hadn't seen much of each other since. His flight got delayed by the storm, and by the time we realized how serious it was, the roads were already closed. I had always thought the attic would feel like a safe space, like some makeshift childhood fort where bad things stayed on the other side of the door. Instead, it felt like a pressure cooker, hot and damp, the walls closing in as the wind screamed louder than anything I'd heard in my life. The window panes had buckled. Water trickled through the ceiling in a slow but constant rhythm, and at one point I remember wrapping my arms around my knees just to keep from shaking. He saw me struggling and offered the blanket, then sat beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe when the world around you starts falling apart and the roof above you groans like it might rip away any second, the human part of you just wants to cling to something. Or someone. We didn't talk much. We just sat there, pressed together under that scratchy blanket, our shoulders touching as the hours passed. His hand found mine at one point, and I told myself it was for comfort. That was all. It had to be. He'd lost his stepfather, I'd lost my husband, and grief does strange things to people. It slows time, sharpens emotions, makes the skin hungry for familiarity. I needed warmth, not meaning. That's what I repeated to myself when I felt him shift closer. That's what I told myself when I didn't move away. There were moments, short ones, where I noticed how long his eyelashes were, or how his breath tickled the edge of my jaw when he turned his head. I hated myself for noticing. Not because it was wrong, although maybe it was, but because it made something inside me flicker that I couldn't quite define. The kind of flicker that's buried under years of responsibility and expectation. The kind that gets dimmed by grocery lists and mortgage payments and the ache behind your knees that shows up every time it rains. Was it just the storm? Was it just fear and proximity and not enough sleep? Or was it something buried deeper than that? Some fragile thread between comfort and longing that had somehow unraveled? I didn't speak the next morning. I just got up and opened the attic hatch and climbed down, one shaky step at a time, trying not to look back as he followed me. Back as he didn't speak either. He just stayed close. Too close. And when we stepped onto the porch, blinking into the morning light, someone across the street saw something they weren't supposed to. They didn't see the fear, or the cold, or the silence that stretched between us like a question we weren't ready to answer. They just saw two people, barefoot and wrapped in one blanket, stepping into daylight with expressions they didn't understand. The moment I saw the photo online, I felt my hands go cold. The comments were already there, each one small but sharp, like tiny cuts. Some were jokes, some were worse. But all of them confirmed what I hadn't yet admitted to myself. That night in the attic had changed something. Subtly, silently, but unmistakably. And here's the thing. I still couldn't say what exactly had changed. But I knew that pretending nothing had happened would be harder than facing what did. I stared at the photo again before closing my phone and sliding it into the drawer. I didn't tell him I'd seen it. Not yet. The house was still damp. The air was still heavy. And my heart, though I didn't want to admit it, felt heavier than it had in years. I left the photo alone. Told myself it would fade the way these things usually do online. 2 days later, it had 300 likes and close to 50 comments, some from people I hadn't heard from in years. I recognized one of them. The neighbor across the street. The one who used to mow his lawn shirtless every Saturday morning, whether it needed it or not. He'd written just 5 words. Didn't look like just grief. It sat there under the photo like a splinter, visible only if you leaned in close. My son didn't ask about it. Maybe he hadn't seen it yet. Maybe he had and was waiting to see if I'd bring it up first. Either way, he kept his distance. He'd been sleeping on the living room couch, tucked into a pile of towels we'd found in the attic, not even asking to come back upstairs. I noticed he avoided eye contact longer than a second or two, like the space between us had filled with something too heavy to look directly at. I kept busy, cleaned what I could, disinfected surfaces with a vinegar mix since the store was still out of bleach, rewashed every single towel we had, even the ones we hadn't used. The power had come back the night before, but the house still smelled like wet wood and drywall, the kind of smell that settles deep into everything. I couldn't scrub it away. It had soaked in. Same with the photo, I guess. He left for a walk just before noon and didn't come back until dusk. Said he was just getting air, even though the streets were still flooded in places and most people were hauling branches or dragging ruined furniture to the curb. When he walked in, his sneakers were soaked and muddy, and his shirt clung to his chest in a way I wasn't prepared to notice. I turned back to the kitchen, cutting carrots for a soup I wasn't even sure I'd eat. I heard a knock at the front door before I saw the headlights. It was almost dark. The sky, that strange, cotton gray color that makes it hard to tell what time it really is. I opened the door to find someone I hadn't seen in almost a year. The same neighbor who'd posted the photo. He looked exactly the same. Just older around the eyes, with that easy grin he always used when he was about to say something he shouldn't. "Hey," he said, holding up a roll of plastic sheeting. "Figured you might need something to cover the window upstairs. Saw it was busted." I nodded. "Thanks. That's kind of you." He looked past me. Didn't mean to interrupt. "You didn't." He stepped inside before I could invite him, walking with that casual confidence men sometimes carry when they know you once loved them. His boots left streaks across the hardwood, but I didn't say anything. Behind me, I could feel my son's eyes. He'd come into the hallway quietly, arms crossed like he was waiting for a reason to walk away. The neighbor noticed him, nodded politely. "Hey man, you doing okay?" "Fine." I didn't like the way they looked at each other. Not hostile, not warm either. Just something unreadable hanging between them. After he left, I stayed by the door longer than necessary, pretending to check the lock, pretending to need a minute to breathe. I wasn't sure what unsettled me more, the fact that my ex had just walked in like he belonged here again, or the fact that I hadn't hated it. Maybe I just wanted to feel normal for 5 seconds. Or maybe I wanted something to pull me out of whatever I'd been feeling since the attic. I sat down with my son for dinner. We didn't speak much. He picked at the soup. I noticed he hadn't changed his clothes since the storm. I wanted to say something, maybe ask if he needed to talk, but the words stayed stuck just behind my teeth. Instead, I told him I might have someone come by to help with the upstairs window. He didn't respond. Later that night, I found his phone charging in the corner of the kitchen. The screen was lit up with a message from someone named Carmen, the preview reading, "Is it true what they're saying online?" I locked the screen and walked away, unsure of what unsettled me more, the question itself or the fact that someone was asking it. Was it true? That's what scared me most, that I didn't know how to answer. Around midnight, I heard the front door open and shut. I found him on the porch, sitting on the steps barefoot with a glass of water in one hand. The moonlight cut across his face in sharp lines, and for a second, he looked so much older than 22. I sat next to him and didn't say a word. We just listened to the cicadas and the distant hum of a generator a few houses down. He didn't look at me when he finally spoke. "Why do you think people always assume the worst?" I shrugged. "Because it makes them feel smarter." He took a sip of water, then let out a small laugh, the kind that doesn't mean anything except that you're tired. "Was it that bad?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for his hand without thinking, then pulled back before I made contact. He stood up first. "I'm going to bed." "Okay." He hesitated in the doorway. "You should probably fix that window tomorrow. If the rain comes back?" "I know." The door closed behind him with a soft thud. I stayed on the porch longer than I should have, replaying the question he didn't really ask, the one that lived in the pause between his words. Why hadn't I pulled away sooner? It was getting harder to pretend nothing had happened. Harder to sleep with the silence. Harder to be in the same room without wondering if he could feel it too. That strange electricity that only shows up when you're trying your hardest not to feel anything at all. And somewhere deep down, I already knew the worst part. It wasn't what people were saying. It was what I hadn't said. The next few days blurred together the way wet pages do when you leave a book out in the sun too long. Things were quiet, maybe too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from tension held carefully between teeth. The house started to dry. The upstairs window was covered now. The neighbor had come by twice, each time with a tool belt and a too-easy smile, acting like nothing had changed since last spring. I let him in because it felt simpler than saying no, though I kept my eyes on the door each time he stepped into a room I wasn't in. My son and I circled each other like people trying not to wake a sleeping dog. We spoke only when necessary. Meals were shorter. Music played a little louder than usual in the background, like we were both trying to drown something out. I watched him move through the house with a new quietness, like he was trying to be invisible, and it made my chest tighten in a way I didn't have a name for. And what would I even call it? Regret? Longing? Fear of what might still be coming? On Friday evening, I asked if he wanted to ride with me to the store. He nodded, no questions. I think we both needed the change of scenery, even if it was just aisles of canned goods and strangers pretending life was normal again. We didn't talk much in the car, just drove with the windows cracked open, letting in the sharp salt air still heavy with storm residue. His arm rested on the window ledge, one hand curled under his chin. I could see the edge of a new scar on his forearm, faint but visible. And for a moment, I wanted to ask about it. I didn't. After the store, we sat in the driveway with the engine still running. The sun had dipped behind the trees and the sky was washed out in that soft gold that makes everything feel slower, like time is melting. I turned off the radio but didn't open the door. Neither did he. He was the one who broke the quiet. "You ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't gone up into that attic?" I looked at him. His voice was low, calm, but there was something underneath it. A hesitation, a searching. "I try not to," I said, because it was the truth. "Yeah," he replied, nodding once. I watched his hand rub slowly over his jeans like he was trying to wipe something invisible away. The way he stared forward made me nervous, not because of what he might say, but because I didn't trust what I might say in return. There's something about the way the world stops when you're stuck like that, he said, like time doesn't follow rules anymore. I knew what he meant. That night in the attic, time had folded in on itself. The wind had sounded like a train screaming through the walls, and the house had shifted under our weight like a raft in dark water. I'd held him without thinking, and he'd let me. And neither of us had spoken when his arm slid around my waist under the blanket. We hadn't said anything because there wasn't anything to say. There wasn't anything. That silence still lived between us now. He looked at me then, fully. His eyes didn't blink. Did it mean anything? He asked. The breath caught in my throat before I could stop it. I tried to find words that felt safe, but everything sounded dishonest. I don't know, I said finally. Maybe it was just the storm. His mouth twitched like he was about to smile, but it didn't happen. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, just enough that I could feel the heat from his body. My hands stayed frozen on my lap. I told myself to open the door, to get out, to shift the weight of the moment somewhere else. But I didn't move. He leaned in, slowly, like he was giving me time to change my mind. His eyes never left mine, and I could see the worry behind them, the question he couldn't ask with words. When his lips touched mine, it wasn't sudden. It wasn't rough. It was soft and full of doubt, like he expected me to stop him halfway through. But I didn't. For a few seconds, the world tilted. Not violently, just enough to let something unfamiliar slide in. The kiss was careful, cautious, too long to call accidental and too short to pretend it didn't happen. When it ended, he didn't pull away fast. He just sat there looking at me, waiting for a reaction I didn't have the courage to give. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked just enough to remind me that he was still my son, still the same boy who used to curl up at the foot of my bed during thunderstorms because he didn't like the sound of the wind against the window. I turned my face toward the passenger side window, staring at the reflection of my own hands. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure what I meant by it. Because it wasn't okay. Not really. Not in the ways it should have been. We sat in silence for what felt like forever. The kind of silence that isn't empty. The kind that holds too much. I reached for the door handle eventually and stepped out into the cool evening air, the groceries forgotten in the back seat. He followed a moment later, closing the car door so gently it barely made a sound. Back inside the house, we moved separately. No words, no glances, just the sound of the fridge opening and a bag crinkling as I shoved vegetables inside without really looking. Later that night, I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth and staring at the mirror like it might give me an answer. The woman in the reflection didn't look like someone who just kissed her son. She looked like someone who couldn't understand how it had come to this. Someone who'd spent years surviving and wasn't sure what to do with the quiet that followed survival. And what scared me wasn't the kiss. It was how still I'd felt afterward. I climbed into bed with the lights off. I didn't check my phone. I didn't listen for his footsteps. I just lay there listening to my own breath and wondering what part of me had stopped working the day we came down from that attic. I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared of anything dramatic happening. It was quieter than usual that night. No wind, no creaking from the beams. Just the dull hum of the fridge and the occasional drip from a spot in the ceiling we still hadn't patched. But even with all that stillness, my body refused to settle. I lay there under the quilt, my eyes open in the dark, tracing the outline of the ceiling fan even though it wasn't spinning. I could hear him in the other room, moving around like he couldn't sleep either. Once or twice, I thought I heard his door open and close, light enough to pretend it didn't happen. By morning, I felt like someone had run sandpaper across the inside of my chest. My stomach ached from how tight I'd been holding it all night. And for what? A kiss? A pause too long in the driveway? A line that should have never been approached? I brushed my teeth and tried not to look at myself. Then I put on the only clean blouse I had that didn't smell like bleach and told myself it was time to get something, anything, back to normal. So when the neighbor showed up again, holding a sack of hardware store items and a tin of cheap coffee cake, I didn't stop him from coming in. He was all smiles like always, said something about the forecast, then about the mosquitoes, then asked how I'd been holding up. I told him I was tired. That was true. I didn't mention anything else. He walked into the kitchen and dropped the sack on the counter like he'd lived here once, which I guess he almost had years ago, before things had changed, before I'd remarried, before I'd moved on. He smelled like clean laundry and car upholstery, and something about the way he stood there, filling up that small kitchen, made me feel like I'd been holding my breath since the hurricane hit. His eyes landed on me as I leaned against the fridge, my arms crossed more out of habit than mood, and I noticed how his face softened a little, like he saw something in me that made him stop trying so hard. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, but it wasn't convincing. He stepped a little closer. Not too close, just enough. I didn't pull away when he put his hand on my arm. I didn't flinch when he tilted his head, just slightly. That way he used to before kissing me years ago in the garage on summer nights when the door was halfway open and we thought no one could see us. My heart wasn't pounding. Not like it had in the car with my son. This was something else. Slower, safer, more familiar. So I let him kiss me. It wasn't a deep kiss. It wasn't wild or needy. Just steady. Just enough to remind me I could still feel something without wondering if I was going to shatter from it. His hands touched my waist and stayed there. And for a brief, suspended moment, I thought maybe this was what I needed to quiet the noise in my head. The front door creaked. I didn't react at first. Neither of us did. I thought maybe it was just the wind. The frame had been loose since the storm. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of sneakers on the entryway tile. I stepped back quickly. He did too. I looked toward the hallway and there he was, my son. Standing just inside the door, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything. His eyes flicked from me to the man beside me, then back again, and that was all it took. A few seconds of silence that made my skin burn worse than if he'd screamed. He didn't drop the grocery bag he was holding, didn't break eye contact, didn't even blink. He just turned and walked away, heading down the hall like it didn't matter, like it hadn't happened. But it had. The neighbor cleared his throat and stepped away, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't sure if he should speak. "You want me to—" I shook my head. He didn't argue. He left through the back door. Said nothing else. I stood in the kitchen alone, staring at the place where he'd been standing and feeling something in me start to come apart, piece by piece, in that quiet way that doesn't make noise until it's already over. I should have followed my son. I should have said something. But I didn't know what words could possibly come out of my mouth that wouldn't sound wrong. I wasn't even sure who I was trying to protect anymore. Myself, him, the idea that maybe we were just two people doing the best we could. But who was I kidding? Wasn't it already too late for that? Later, I walked past his door. It was half closed. I could hear music playing low. Some instrumental thing he always listened to when he was in a mood he didn't want to explain. I stood there for a moment, hoping maybe he'd notice. Maybe he'd say something. He didn't, so I kept walking. I went out to the porch and sat on the step, watching the clouds roll over the tops of the neighbors' trees. The humidity made everything stick to my skin, and I pressed my hands between my knees just to feel something solid. What had I done? It was a question I'd asked myself before, usually after arguments or bad choices or long nights alone. But this time, it carried weight. It wasn't just regret. It was consequence. It was realizing that maybe I hadn't been trying to fix anything at all. Maybe I'd been trying to bury something too complicated to face. And now he'd seen it. All of it. There was no explaining that kiss away. No dressing it up as a friendly gesture or a thank you for help. Not after everything that had already happened. Not after that night in the car. Not after the attic. I sat there until the sky darkened and the porch lights came on, automatic, flickering once before holding steady. The neighbor didn't come back. My son didn't leave his room, and I didn't have the courage to knock. I didn't hear from the neighbor again for a few days. Not a text, not a knock, not even the usual knock-knock emoji he liked to send when he was dropping something at the door. At first, I thought maybe he was giving me space, then I realized it probably wasn't that noble. He'd seen the way my son looked at us in the kitchen, the silence that followed, the way I stood frozen with my hand still near my waist, like I hadn't even thought to move it yet. The truth was, I didn't know what either of them were thinking anymore. And the more I tried to find the right thing to say, the more it felt like trying to clean up a spill with wet hands, just moving the mess around without actually fixing anything. That Friday, someone slid an invitation under the door. No envelope. Just a folded half sheet of colored paper from the community board. It was for a neighborhood gathering, a post-storm relief and fundraising dinner held at the community center 2 streets over. Food, music, cheap raffle prizes, a short speech or two. The kind of thing we used to show up for without thinking. I considered not going, but part of me felt like I owed it to the neighborhood. Or maybe I just needed to feel like part of something again, even if only for a couple of hours. I left the invitation on the kitchen table. He picked it up the next morning while pouring cereal, looked at it without saying anything, then set it down beside his bowl like it had been junk mail. "You going?" he asked finally, his voice flat. "I haven't decided yet," I said, trying not to sound too eager or too apologetic. He nodded, then finished eating in silence. I didn't ask if he'd join me. I didn't think I needed to. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I wasn't dressing up. It wasn't that kind of event. But I did spend an extra minute smoothing the sleeves of my cardigan and fixing a flyaway strand of hair. I don't know who I was trying to look presentable for. Maybe no one. Maybe everyone. The center was half full when I arrived. Folding chairs, crock pots along the back wall, a makeshift stage with a microphone and a banner that read, "We rebuild together." The lights flickered once. No one seemed to notice. I found a seat near the middle, close enough to seem engaged, but not so close I'd be called on. I spotted him before he saw me. The neighbor, standing near the far corner with a plastic cup in one hand and a napkin in the other. He was laughing with someone, but his eyes kept drifting around the room like he was waiting for something to start. When he finally saw me, his face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. I offered a small nod. He returned it. About halfway through the dinner, a woman in a yellow blouse got up and thanked everyone for helping clean the park, then handed the mic to the neighbor, who stepped onto the low platform with that same easy confidence he always carried. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. "Evening, folks," he started, voice loud enough to carry, but not so formal it felt forced. "It's been a rough few weeks. I think we all know that. Lost shingles, power lines. Some of us lost more than that. Light chuckles here and there." I folded my hands together in my lap. "But you know what storms do better than anything else?" he continued. "They don't just knock things down. They uncover what's already been cracked. The walls that were hollow. The places where the roof was never sealed right to begin with." I felt the shift before he said the next part, like the air changed texture. "And sometimes," he said, eyes moving slowly through the room, "a storm shows you what's been happening behind closed doors. Things you thought were private. Things you thought wouldn't ever see daylight." I couldn't breathe. Not fully. He didn't look at me directly, but the pause after his sentence said everything. "Now," he added with a faint smile, "that might sound like gossip. It's not. It's just truth. And we all know truth has a way of rising up, just like the water." Laughter, nervous and scattered. I stared at my folded hands and wondered if anyone else had noticed that my knuckles had turned white. He stepped down from the stage and disappeared into the crowd. I waited 5 minutes before leaving. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, and the sidewalk felt strangely soft under my flats. I walked the 2 blocks back home without stopping. No one called after me. No one said my name. When I stepped inside the house, it was quiet. No music, no movement, just the ticking of the old clock above the stove. I didn't realize I was shaking until I tried to open the refrigerator and my hand slipped on the handle. He came into the kitchen 5 minutes later. "You went," he said. Not a question. I nodded. "Did he say it?" he asked. "Out loud?" I shook my head. "Not directly. But it was about us," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He didn't move, just stood there barefoot in the hallway, arms at his sides, eyes fixed somewhere near the floor like he was doing math in his head, trying to calculate what it all meant now. "I should have left when the storm cleared," he said finally. I didn't have an answer. Not a good one. Not one that wouldn't sound like a defense or an excuse or worse. A plea. "I'm gonna pack a bag," he added. "I'll stay at Ryan's for a while." "Okay," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. He turned, walked back down the hall, and disappeared behind his bedroom door. I didn't follow. I stood there a while, staring at nothing in particular, until I noticed something near the back door. A little scrap of paper torn from a notepad. Just one sentence scribbled in blue ink, left behind by the neighbor earlier that week. It read, "You can only hide in the attic for so long." I picked it up, folded it in half, and placed it in the drawer with the rest of the mail. What was left to say? The first thing I noticed that morning was how quiet the hallway felt. Not just empty, but drained, like whatever had lived in it before had packed up in the night and left with him. His bedroom door was open. The bed was neatly made, no stray socks on the floor, no books on the nightstand, not even a charger cable hanging off the edge of the dresser. He had packed in silence and vanished just as quietly, leaving behind nothing that would make me think he'd ever intended to stay. There was a sticky note on the fridge. "I took the car. I'll bring it back next week. You can use the truck." No signature, no emojis. Just that slanted handwriting I used to recognize on permission slips and birthday cards. I stared at it for a long time. Not reading it, just letting it sit there. Like it had weight. Like it could somehow explain the way my chest kept tightening every time I breathed too deep. The neighbor hadn't come back either. After his speech at the gala, I figured he wouldn't. Or maybe he already had what he wanted. A few good laughs, some attention, the comfort of being the one to expose instead of the one being exposed. People in small towns love the role of righteous witness. It lets them sidestep their own shame. I spent most of the day cleaning again. The kitchen, the baseboards, the windows. Not because they needed it. They didn't. But because it gave my hands something to do. At one point, I found a broken clothespin under the couch and held it like it might tell me something. I set it on the windowsill and left it there. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard a sound at the front door. Not a knock, not mail either. Just a soft rustling. When I opened it, no one was there. But sitting on the mat was a thick manila envelope, the kind used for legal papers or contracts, sealed with clear tape and my name written across the front in heavy black marker. I carried it into the kitchen and placed it on the counter, then stood there, staring at it like it might make the first move. I thought about not opening it, about sliding it into a drawer and pretending it had never come. But of course I didn't. Pretending had gotten me here. The first page was a printed screenshot of the Facebook post. The same photo I'd seen weeks ago. Me and my son stepping out of the attic, barefoot and too close, the blanket draped unevenly around us. Underneath the image was a list of comments, each one circled in red pen, some underlined twice. "Look at the way she's holding him. This ain't just bad lighting. This is bad parenting. Makes you wonder what else happened in that house." Dozens more. Printed page after page. People I knew, people I didn't. Some hiding behind fake names, others commenting with their real profiles like it was just another post about potholes or zoning permits. One of them had written, "Shame doesn't have a volume. It just sits in the room until everyone smells it. That line stuck to me harder than the rest, not because it was cruel, they all were in their own way, but because it was right. Shame doesn't scream. It doesn't beg or explain. It just stays there, heavy as wet wool, until you either learn to carry it or throw it out with the trash. I sat down at the table and kept flipping through the pages. Every time I thought the stack was finished, another sheet appeared. More comments, more names. One page had a printout of my ex-husband's profile with a status he'd posted. People show their real faces when the storm passes. No context. No replies. Just that line. And yet I knew it was for me. There were no threats in the envelope. No notes. Nothing illegal. Just the evidence of what happens when your private world becomes public without your consent. And no one had to twist anything. No one had to invent it. The damage wasn't a lie. It was a mirror. I folded the pages back into the envelope, sealed it again, and slid it into the laundry cabinet behind the dryer sheets. Out of sight, but not gone. That night, I made myself dinner. A small bowl of rice with frozen peas and an overcooked egg on top. I ate it in silence at the table, the same seat I'd sat in the night after the storm, when we were still shaking from the attic and not yet sure how to speak about it. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would, after everything. But there was no sadness left in me to spill. Just the slow realization that no one was coming back through that door. And if they did, they wouldn't see me the same way again. Around 9, I walked out onto the porch. The air was warm, just sticky enough to pull at your clothes. I sat in the old wicker chair and listened to the cicadas grind through the trees. Across the street, someone's TV flickered through a curtain. Dogs barked in the distance. And I remembered that night again. The one in the attic. The weight of the blanket. The slow way his arm found mine. The silence. That strange safety. I remembered the moment I didn't move away. And I finally stopped asking myself why. Because it hadn't been about attraction. Not really. It hadn't been about romance or rebellion or anything so easily labeled. It had been about grief. It had been about heat and skin and the unbearable weight of loneliness wrapped in storm sounds. About how two people, lost in their own ways, reached for something that felt like comfort and found something far more dangerous. He hadn't texted. I hadn't called. We both knew the silence meant more than any conversation could. And now the town knew too. I leaned back in the chair and let my head rest against the siding. The porch light buzzed above me, flickering once, then holding steady. Across the street, a motion light blinked on. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. That part was done. There's something strange about surviving a storm only to realize the real damage came after. Not in the wind or the water or the trees that cracked like bones, but in the things that came out once the power came back. The truths that sat in the daylight, ugly and undeniable. People rebuild their houses, their fences, their driveways, but no one tells you how to rebuild yourself when the damage came from something you can't name.